In 1536, a jousting lance slammed into Henry VIII and opened a wound on his leg that never healed. For 11 years, it festered, oozed, and stank so badly that courtiers gagged when they came near him. Yet as his body rotted from the inside out, his appetite only grew. Number 14 on this list was so rich his own doctors begged him to stop. Number 3 was whispered to be an aphrodisiac he demanded even in his final weeks, when he could barely stand. These 20 dishes were served to a king who weighed nearly 400 pounds and had to be hauled through his palace in a wheeled chair. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 20 twisted dishes Henry VIII demanded as his body decayed. Number 20. Roasted swan. On the Tudor table, a bird you could not eat elsewhere was exactly the bird a king demanded. Every mute swan in England technically belonged to the crown, which made roasting one the ultimate flex of royal power. The kitchens at Hampton Court would pluck the bird, roast it whole, then sew the skin and neck back on so it arrived at the table looking alive, its wings arranged mid-flight. Henry's carvers presented it on a silver charger, glistening with fat. The meat itself was dark, greasy, and honestly tough, closer to old goose than anything delicate. But nobody dared say so. The point was not flavor. The point was that this man could eat the king's own birds off the king's own rivers, and no one in the realm could stop him. By the 1540s, when his gout was so bad he screamed if a servant brushed his foot, he still demanded swan at feasts. It was proof he was still Henry. Number 19. Peacock in its own feathers. If swan was a statement, peacock was theater. The bird was skinned carefully so the feathered hide stayed in one piece, the body roasted, then the whole plumed skin draped back over it, and the tail fanned out in full display. Cooks sometimes gilded the beak with gold leaf and stuffed a wad of camphor-soaked cotton in its mouth so it could be lit on fire and carried flaming into the great hall. Imagine that arriving before a 400-pound king slumped in his chair, a burning golden peacock, servants scattering. The meat was dry and stringy, described by those brave enough to write it down as barely worth chewing. But Henry did not eat peacock to be full. He ate it because a flaming gold-beaked bird told every ambassador in the room exactly whose court they were standing in. Spectacle was the seasoning. Number 18. Lampreys. Here's where Henry's tastes turn genuinely strange to modern eyes. Lampreys are eel-like fish with a round mouth full of teeth, and they were considered a delicacy fit for kings. Henry adored them. His cooks would bleed the lamprey, cook it slowly in its own blood mixed with wine and spices, and set it in a thick, dark, almost pudding-like pie. The blood gave the dish a metallic richness that Tudor nobles prized, and almost everyone today would find revolting. His own great-grandfather-era predecessor, Henry I, was said to have died from eating too many of them, a surfeit of lampreys. Henry VIII knew the story. He ordered them anyway. As his body swelled and his physicians warned him off heavy, fatty foods, the blood-cooked lamprey pie stayed on his table, a dish so rich it sat in the stomach like a stone. Number 17. Whole roasted boar's head. Nothing said Christmas at Henry's court like a severed pig's head carried in on a platter, an apple or an orange jammed between its jaws, rosemary tucked behind its ears. The boar's head was the centerpiece of the winter feast, paraded in with musicians while a carol was sung. The head was brined, boiled, then roasted until the skin crackled, and the meat around the cheeks and snout, the parts most people never touch, were considered the finest bites in the whole animal. Henry's court would have gone through dozens of pigs during the 12 days of Christmas. For a king already struggling with a body that could no longer process the fat and salt he poured into it, the boar's head was the worst possible indulgence and exactly the one he refused to give up. Tradition mattered more than his physicians ever would. Number 16. Marchpane subtleties. Sugar in Tudor England was so expensive it was practically a jewel, and Henry ate it like a man who had never once been told no. Marchpane, an early marzipan of ground almonds and sugar, was sculpted by his confectioners into elaborate showpieces called subtleties. Castles, ships, the royal coat of arms, even scenes with tiny sugar figures. These were built as edible sculptures, sometimes several feet across, and set before the king so he could smash and eat the very symbols of his own power. But here is the darker truth. All that sugar was destroying him from the mouth inward. Contemporary accounts and later examinations suggest Henry's teeth were black and rotting, a condition that fits a man drowning in refined sugar decades before anyone understood what it did. The king who ate his own coat of arms and almond paste was also the king whose breath, by the end, made servants turn away. Number 15. Hippocras. Wine was not enough for Henry. He drank Hippocras, red wine heavily spiced with cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and grains of paradise, then sweetened with yet more sugar and strained through a cloth cone until it ran clear and warm. It was considered a digestive, something to settle the stomach after a monstrous meal, which tells you everything about how much Henry was eating. He reportedly went through gallons of wine and ale daily, water being unsafe to drink. As his health collapsed, the sweet-spiced wine kept flowing. The problem is that Hippocras is essentially sugar, alcohol, and spice, exactly the trio a gout-riddled, ulcerated, morbidly obese man should never touch. Every warm golden cup was another push toward the grave. He drank it believing it was medicine. First pattern break. Here is where this stops being a menu and starts being a slow death. That leg wound from 1536 never closed. Over the years, it turned into a chronic ulcer, and historians believe he may have developed a second one on the other leg. The wounds oozed constantly and had to be lanced and drained, filling his private chambers with a stench so foul that his approach could be smelled before he was seen. He grew so heavy that a mechanical chair and pulley system were built to haul him up the stairs at his palaces. His armor from his youth had a 32-inch waist. By the end, it measured over 50. And through every bit of that decline, the kitchens never slowed down. They cooked as if he were still the golden athlete prince of 1509, because the alternative was admitting the king was rotting alive. Number 14. Beef and mutton by the hundredweight. This is the dish his doctors begged him to abandon. Henry was, above all, a meat eater in an age when meat meant status, and he consumed it in quantities that stagger belief. Royal records show his household going through thousands of oxen, sheep, calves, and pigs in a single year. A typical royal meal offered the king a rotating parade of roasted beef, boiled mutton, veal, and pork, course after course, with vegetables treated as an afterthought or a peasant food beneath him. As his body failed, physicians of the era understood at least that rich, fatty flesh was inflaming his gout, which flares violently on a diet heavy in red meat and alcohol. They pleaded with him. He ignored them. To Henry, refusing meat was refusing to be a king, and he would rather die a king than live a lighter man. Number 13. Roasted larks and songbirds. Tudor kitchens did not waste a bird just because it was tiny. Larks, sparrows, thrushes, and other small songbirds were caught in nets by the hundreds, plucked and roasted whole, then eaten in 1 or 2 bites, bones and all. They were sometimes baked into pies packed so tightly they formed a single crackling mass of tiny roasted birds. For a king, they were a refined nibble, delicate and slightly bitter, a dish that showed his kitchen could turn even a sparrow into something worthy of royalty. There is something grotesque about it now, an entire songbird crushed between the teeth of a man too heavy to walk. But in Henry's world, the ability to serve platters of these fragile little creatures was its own kind of boast. I command so much that even the birds in the hedgerows are mine to eat. Number 12. Porpoise and whale. The sea gave Henry things almost no one else in England could touch. Porpoise was classified as a royal fish, meaning it belonged to the crown, and it appeared at the king's table roasted or baked in a spiced sauce. The flesh was dark, oily, and strongly flavored, closer to liver-heavy meat than to fish. Whale meat and blubber also turned up in royal accounts, treated as a luxury precisely because hauling one ashore was such an enormous undertaking. To modern taste, it sounds nightmarish, chewy sea mammal flesh reeking of oil, but Henry's cooks smothered it in ginger, pepper, and vinegar to tame it. The dish was less about pleasure and more about exclusivity. When you are the only man in the kingdom legally allowed to eat the creatures of the deep, you eat them, whether they taste good or not. Number 11. Venison, from the Royal Hunt. In his prime, Henry was a magnificent hunter, riding down deer across his private parks for hours. By the 1540s, those days were gone, his leg too ruined to sit a horse for long. So the venison came to him instead. Deer from the royal forests were roasted, baked into thick pastry coffins, or turned into rich, spiced stews. Venison pasties were a particular favorite, the dark meat sealed inside heavy crusts with wine and seasoning. There is a sadness buried in this dish. The meat on his plate was a reminder of the vigorous young king he used to be, the one who could gallop all day and dance all night. Now he ate the spoils of a hunt he could no longer join, spooning stewed deer into a body that had betrayed him, chasing a version of himself that no longer existed. Number 10. Comfits. Second pattern break. Let us talk about the machine that fed this man. The kitchens at Hampton Court were not a room. They were an entire complex, dozens of interconnected rooms with fires roaring day and night, staffed by around 200 people whose only job was to feed the court. They roasted whole oxen on spits turned by boys who worked in furnace heat. They baked in massive brick ovens, brewed rivers of ale, and prepared roughly 600 meals twice a day for the royal household. This was one of the largest and most advanced kitchens in all of Europe, an industrial operation built for a single purpose: never, under any circumstances, let the king want for food. As Henry decayed, that machine kept running at full roar, an empire of fire and grease dedicated to a dying man's appetite. Comfits were seeds, nuts, or spices, aniseed, caraway, coriander, or almonds, coated in layer after layer of hardened sugar, an early ancestor of the candied treat. Making them took days of slowly rolling the centers in warm sugar syrup until a hard shell built up. Henry kept dishes of them close, popping them between courses and after meals, supposedly to aid digestion and freshen the breath. Given the state of his mouth by the end, black-toothed and foul, the breath freshening did not stand a chance. But comfits were also pure status. They were sugar showing off, expensive to the point of absurdity, eaten by the handful by a man who saw no reason to ration anything. Every crunch was another tiny hammer blow to the ruined teeth in his head. Number 9. Sturgeon. Another royal fish, another dish reserved for the king by law. Sturgeon, the giant armored river fish, was so prized that any caught in English waters technically had to be offered to the crown. Henry's cooks poached it, roasted it, or set it in jelly, and its firm, meaty flesh was considered among the finest food in the realm. The truly staggering part was the sheer expense and effort of getting one to the table. A single large sturgeon was an event. To serve it was to announce that the natural world itself bent to the king's hunger. Even as the king grew too swollen and sick to move on his own, the rivers were still being emptied of their rarest fish to satisfy him. Nothing in the kingdom, on land, in the sky, or under the water, was safe from Henry's plate. Number 8. The living pie. This one sounds like a fairy tale, and it very nearly was. Tudor banquets loved a shock, and one of the grandest was a huge pie crust baked hollow, then filled at the last moment with live songbirds. When it was cut open before the king, the birds burst out in a chaos of wings and panic, delighting the court. Yes, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie was based on a real party trick. Sometimes the pie held frogs, or even a small person who popped out to entertain the room. It was food as prank, food as theater, food designed to make a decaying king laugh. Picture it. Henry, barely able to rise from his chair, ulcers seeping through his bandages, roaring with laughter as live birds explode from a pie across the hall. The spectacle had to be enormous because the man it entertained was slipping away. Number 7. Spiced capon. The capon, a castrated rooster fattened for tenderness, was one of the softest, richest birds a Tudor kitchen could produce, and Henry demanded it constantly. It was roasted or boiled and served swimming in sauces thick with wine, almonds, ginger, and saffron, that last spice worth its weight in gold. Saffron alone made a dish a royal one. The capon's appeal, as Henry's health worsened, was partly that it was soft enough to eat easily, a small mercy for a man whose rotting teeth made tougher meats agony. But the sauces were another river of sugar and spice pouring into a body that could no longer cope. Even the gentle dishes on Henry's table were traps. There was no such thing as a light meal for this king. Everything, even a simple bird, was drowned in richness until it became a hazard. Number 6. Quince paste and marmalade. Henry had a sweet tooth that bordered on the pathological, and one of his favorite indulgences was preserved fruit, especially quince boiled down with enormous quantities of sugar into a dense, sliceable paste. This early marmalade was firm enough to cut with a knife and was eaten as a treat at the end of a meal, believed to settle the stomach. Boxes of it were imported and made in the royal kitchens by the pound. Once again, the theme repeats. What Henry believed was medicine, a stomach-soothing sweet, was in truth just more concentrated sugar, accelerating the decay of his teeth and adding to the load his failing body carried. He reached for the quince paste the way a modern person reaches for antacids, never understanding that the cure and the disease were the very same spoonful. Third pattern break. Now we reach the desperate final months. By late 1546, Henry was a wreck. He could barely walk, his legs were suppurating, his body was enormous, and he almost certainly suffered from a tangle of conditions, gout, possibly type 2 diabetes, chronic infection, and more. He grew paranoid and enraged, lashing out at those around him. And still he ate, and still the whispered remedies came, foods rumored to restore a man's vigor, to bring back the strength and virility of his youth. A dying king surrounded by physicians who dared not fail him became a target for every supposed miracle food in the realm. The next few dishes were served not just to feed him, but to try to save him, or at least to make him feel for one meal like the young lion he had once been. Number 5. Eel pie. Eels were everywhere in Tudor England, cheap enough for peasants but refined enough, when prepared richly, for a king. Henry's version was no humble supper. His cooks skinned and chunked the eels, layered them into a deep pastry with butter, wine, and warming spices, and baked them into a heavy, glistening pie. The flesh turned soft and unctuous, almost buttery, held together by a jelly of its own rendered fat. For a king with failing teeth, an eel pie was tender and easy, one more soft, fat-laden dish he could manage. But eel is oily and dense, and folded into pastry and butter, it became yet another brick of fat dropped into a body that had long since stopped being able to burn it off. Even the humblest fish in England, in Henry's kitchen, became a weapon aimed at his own health. Number 4. Roasted heron and crane. Among the strangest birds to grace a royal table were the tall wading birds, herons and cranes, hunted with falcons and roasted whole for the pleasure of the king. These were prestige dishes precisely because catching them required trained hawks and skilled falconers, a sport of the nobility. The meat was dark, fishy, and frankly unpleasant by most accounts, tasting of the marshes and rivers the birds fed in. But taste was never the point at Henry's court, as you have surely gathered by now. The point was that a heron on the plate meant a hunt in the sky, meant falcons and privilege and power. Serving a bird almost no commoner could ever legally take was simply another way of saying everything that flies, swims, walks, or grows in England answers, in the end, to me. Number 3. Oysters. Here is the dish whispered to be an aphrodisiac, pressed on the king in his final desperate season. Oysters were plentiful and cheap in Tudor England, eaten by rich and poor alike, but they carried a reputation, then as now, for restoring a man's vigor. For a king obsessed his whole life with fathering sons, a king on his sixth marriage, a king whose body had utterly failed him, that reputation made the humble oyster suddenly precious. They were served raw, stewed in wine, or baked into pies. Whether Henry truly believed a plate of shellfish could bring back the virile young king of 30 years earlier, we cannot know for certain. But the image is haunting. A bloated, dying man swallowing oysters in his stinking chamber, chasing a ghost of the man he used to be, one slippery mouthful at a time. Number 2. Custards, tarts, and creams. Toward the end, when solid food became harder to manage, the soft sweets came into their own. Henry's kitchens produced rich egg custards, cream tarts, fools of stewed fruit folded into cream, and delicate baked puddings sweetened with sugar and perfumed with rose water and spice. These were among the few things a man with a ruined mouth and a swollen, aching body could still enjoy without pain. But softness was the only kindness in them. Everyone was a dense mixture of eggs, cream, and sugar, exactly the load his body could no longer handle. In his final weeks, this may have been much of what sustained him. Spoonfuls of sweet cream fed to a king who could no longer feast the way he once had. The Lion of Europe, reduced at the last to soft puddings. Number 1. The endless feast itself. The single most twisted dish Henry VIII demanded was not one dish at all. It was the feast that never stopped. Until nearly the very end, this man insisted on being served multiple courses of the richest food in the known world, twice a day, every day, regardless of what his body was screaming at him. Meat upon meat, sauce upon sauce, sugar upon sugar, wine upon wine, an unbroken tide of indulgence poured into a frame that could no longer contain it. His doctors warned him. His body warned him. With pain, with rot, with the stench that emptied rooms. He did not, could not, would not stop. Henry VIII did not simply enjoy his food. He ate himself into the grave with the full, roaring machinery of the greatest kitchen in Europe behind him, refusing to the last to be anything less than a king at the table. On January 28, 1547, that appetite finally caught up with him. Here is my question for you. Which of these would you have dared to taste at Henry's table? The blood-cooked lamprey pie, the flaming golden peacock, the porpoise in ginger sauce? Drop it in the comments. And tell me, do you think Henry knew exactly what he was doing to himself? Or did a king who had never once been told no simply not believe his own body could betray him? Because the truth is, the most powerful man in England was destroyed by the one thing no crown could command: his own appetite.